So the world economy in Jackson Hole, we're in a really funny time in the global economy, in that there's a case for the bull market to improve, and there's a case for the bear market to reassert itself. But if you step back a year ago, Jay Powell's speech at Jackson Hole Symposium was on the transitory nature of inflation, where inflation was running about 5% in July of this year. The headline dropped from 9.1 back to 8.5. At the same time, as the central bankers got together last year, they were talking about maybe having inflation coming down a bit in Europe, and that really hit a 8.9% high in July. And now Citi has forecast that UK inflation could reach 18.6% in January of next year. So we're at a really interesting time for what's going on in the world and what's going on in inflation. So, and really what the central bankers are going to be doing about it. So I really want to just take a couple minutes and talk about what I think is going on and what I think is going to happen in Jackson Hole. And we have some real challenges for policymakers right now. So let's just take a look. The IMF came out with their projections in July on global growth. And obviously, after a lot of stimulus into the system last year, the global economy was projected to come down this year, as you would expect. But the continued drop next year is of concern, both for the global economy and for the advanced economies. And as we were just talking about, I don't even think that fully factors in the impact of the winter we're going to have and the energy problems that persist and how that flows through the economy. So I think these numbers are a bit optimistic. I would also say that it highlights the unevenness of what's going on and how things have changed in the last month or so. When you think that the emerging economies are showing such strong growth for next year off the IMF projections, and I think they're going to be disappointed in a number of areas, unless, of course, you are a producer and an exporter of rare earths, gas, and the commodities that are in such high demand. But if you're a commodity taker, an importer, you're going to be on the wrong end of that, unless, of course, you're China and India and are getting a deal from Russia on energy right now. But I think it sets up for a big challenge. And I think the biggest issue we're facing right now is a global slowdown that's underway and seems to be accelerating. In large part, the issues that we know that have existed, whether it's the pandemic or the war, continue to persist and continue to weigh on it. I think the supply and demand imbalance is the one that has people a little out of off step. And I think the reason for that is you're seeing pockets of improvement, such as goods coming from Asia to the US and to the Western US ports. You're seeing the transportation prices come down. You're seeing the Baltic Freight Index come down. You're seeing a lot of improvements in that area, though we're still going through a port negotiation on the wages for workers there. But I think you are seeing some improvements. But then in other parts of the world, particularly around food and energy, particularly around Europe and the Middle East and Africa, you're seeing the imbalances on supply and demand working against you, particularly around food. I think the energy crunch that's coming for Europe in the winter is going to be pretty severe. At the same time, China's working through a number of growth challenges, which we'll touch on. But the food and debt crises that usually persist when you have a war or you have central bank tightening like the Fed is doing, those crises arise and are going to be real challenges for certain parts of the global economy. And at the same time, you have this green energy transition, which is not going exactly how people had originally envisioned it, which is creating some inflationary pressures on both the fossil fuel side, but also on the green energy fuels to get the transition to work. So we're really seeing some challenges there. But global growth is supposed to continue to rise. And it's just really a question of how does the global growth work against the debt burdens that we're faced with and against the rising inflation pressures? Do people see a rise in living standards or a decline in living standards? And can the economies grow at a rate that is faster than their rate of their debt and their debt servicing? I think that's going to be the big issue. Not that are we going to have a stronger global economy years out because we continue to innovate, but how uneven is it going to be and who benefits and who gets hurt, I think is really the issue. So switching gears to the US, which we think is the strongest economy and should continue to attract a lot of capital, you see a kind of a steady pace of growth, nothing really heroic. And I think we're back to kind of a similar economy overall to the low growth environment we had in the early 2000s after the tech bubble burst. I think we're going to see a global economy that's growing at a rather anemic rate, but there'll be pockets of opportunity to make money in. And I think the US is really going to be one of the leading lights in that area. As Ed Yardeni has coined it, the TNAC, there's no other alternative country. And I think that's what you're seeing with the US right now is reflective of its inherent strengths, as well as some of its current challenges. So obviously the strength of an economy is reflected in its currency, and the dollar has been quite strong. The US status as the world reserve currency remains pretty intact. We've attracted a lot of capital flows during the pandemic and during the war because of our safe haven status. Our ability to provide our own energy and to be energy self-sufficient is quite strong. We need better policies to take advantage of that. But I think the other advantage that really plays to the US's strength in this period is that we have the deepest and most liquid and most mature capital market systems in the world, supported by the rule of law, which allow confidence to people to invest into the US and in times of challenge. We still have a lot of stimulus that's working through the system, both monetary and fiscal, because we put a lot in over the last 2 years, and it takes about 12 to 18 months for that to work through. But we are starting a pretty aggressive tightening in the US on top of what has been a global tightening process that goes back 18 months. And we're in one of those funny transition periods where the stimulus from last year is still working through, but the tightening is just starting to take hold. And you have these competing forces that are at play and kind of misleading investors to thinking things might be stronger overall than they are globally and in the US. But I think we're starting to see mixed signals, signs of slowing hiring, earnings, and housing challenges in the US. At the same time, you still have inflation running hot in a couple areas, particularly around food and hourly wages. Gas is coming down, but that could be temporary, and we could see a bounce back up in the fall. Switching gears to China, I think this is one of the big stories that's going to play out over the next 12 months is how does China go? How does the rest of the world go? And while on the surface, it looks like they're going to have nice steady growth for the next several years, which they should, they have a lot of characteristics that would lead it to that point. I think what the question I have is, can they continue to persist, given some of the challenges that they're facing and where we are in the global economy and what some of their strengths and weaknesses are? I think the Chinese model is really being tested right now, and it's in its most difficult challenge that it's had, I think, in the last 30 or 40 years. I think it's very rich in resources that are essential to the new age economy that we're moving into, but they're still focused on where do they fit in the global order with President Xi, who wants China to be the number one economy, both from a political and economic and social perspective. He wants to be on top of all three of those. But the pandemic and the war are really creating and challenging his aspirations right now. At the same time, you have the real estate sector, which is 30%, almost 30% of the economy struggling. The lockdowns are both a blessing and a curse in that it allows him to control the economy better, but it does lead to slower growth and other supply chain issues. I think the common prosperity goal is a good one for the country and for social stability, but it does go against the global corporate champions some, as you saw with Alibaba and other countries that ran afoul of the government's aspirations. And I think how they fit and how they determine what innovation occurs versus the common prosperity goals and the role of government versus the role of enterprise really is going to play out. I think the unintended consequences of the Belt and Road are something we're going to be talking about over the next couple of years. But what's lost constantly, I think, in the discussions of China, because the population is so big, is the demographic time bomb that's underway there. With about 11 million college graduates a year that have to be put to work and find goals and jobs for them. At the same time, the country is trying to move up the value chain, and manufacturing is creating some challenges that are really at play here when you're seeing a slowing global economy and a slowing domestic economy. And some of the excesses and the things that have helped get China this spot are now coming back to work against them. And you can get a sense of the challenges they're facing by the fact that they're stimulating when others are tightening and being pretty aggressive. And you saw that again with two stimulative moves yesterday and lowering rates that are going to help housing, but also help the debt loads that they have. So I think there's a really interesting time for China. I think they continue to do okay, but they really have to see if they can get back on a more systemic, higher level of growth and deal with some of the social stability issues that they're going to be faced with. So innovation is going to be one of the keys for any of these regions, and particularly with China as they're going through this common prosperity and corporate champions. I think it's going to be very essential to see how that continues. But at the same time, China's commitment to patents and other things continues to be quite strong. So I don't want to discount them in any way. This is an economy that can work through the challenges, but there are real challenges here for I think the worst that they've faced in the last 30 years. Switching gears to Europe, and I want to focus really on Germany, which is the largest economy. I think this outlook is optimistic. I think that they're going to struggle for growth pretty significantly, as there's a major transition for the German economy that has to undergo. And I think some of the challenges are going to be real and persistent. I think their over-reliance on Russian energy has obviously been a flawed policy that's been exposed. But I think the real other issue that's at play here is the green energy transition and their power issues, particularly as it relates to the drought conditions that exist there and in the rest of the world. Particularly China is another one that's being hurt by it. But as the rest of the world slows, their best customers for their manufacturing are slowing, and that's going to hurt the manufacturing sector. I think these power issues are likely going to lead to a recession for Germany, and may lead to a recession for China and the rest of the world as well. I think the drought conditions around the world are really weighing on the system and are just starting to accelerate. And then as we move into the winter, these power shortages are going to be a problem. But I think what we've seen is the need to invest and increase overall spending has been in existence for a long time. And I think the focus on balancing budgets and stomping out inflation has held them back from making necessary investments in the past. And it's going to be very difficult to play catch up, but they will be making greater investments in their infrastructure and military. And I think that's going to be something that you see throughout Europe. But if the strongest economy is challenged, I think that speaks to the challenges that the rest of Europe has, which leads us to Jackson Hole. And the title for the event in Jackson Hole was Reassessing Constraints on the Economy and Policy. And I think this is really a reflection of the fact that policymakers, whether it's monetary or fiscal policy guys and gals, are up against it right now. You know, Chair Powell speaks on Friday morning, and I think his goal is to bring the markets and the Fed back in line, but it's to really thread the needle on, can they stop inflation and stamp down inflation before it moves forward? And do they have the confidence in the markets that central bankers at the first sign of adversity won't reverse course due to a slowdown, which has hindered them in the past from stamping out inflation? That was one of the issues in the 30s. It was also one of the issues in the 70s. And it's something that the Fed's very cognizant of. But at the same time, you've had massive tightening in the global economy that has helped the Fed considerably. You're seeing that not only with their increase of 150 basis points, the last two meetings with another 50 or 75 coming in September, but you've also seen that with the dollar strengthening, which actually lowers inflationary pressures on the US. You've also seen it with the fact that commodity prices have come down considerably over the last couple months, last quarter, and you're also seeing the dollar strength, which actually creates tightening. And then you add to that, global short rates have risen to about over 3% and could be moving up to 3.5%. And research has shown that global rates have more of an impact than on the US economy than the Fed does. And I think that's something that the markets might be missing. So the Fed might not have to move rates up as much as everyone thinks, but I also think they will not be reversing course and lowering rates. Right after the Fed announcement in July, the betting markets had the Fed cutting rates at 100% level in 2023. That's now down to 60%. And I've been of the view of the last several calls that we've had that I think the market's out of step and the Fed will not lower rates as much as everyone thinks, because I think the global slowdown will be real, but I think getting inflation down is going to be a lot tougher, particularly as it looks like the war is going to drag on and the food problems are going to accelerate. And now we have drought problems making a lot of the food sources and power generation worse, which is going to impact manufacturing and slow the economy down. So I think the central bankers are in a spot where they need to try and maintain their independence and do the right thing. And there's going to be a lot of political pressure for central bankers all over the world to support the economy at a time that inflation needs to be brought under control. And I think that dynamic is really going to be at play. And I think Susan Payne really got it right when she said the big issues for the world right now are renewables, on food, and it's on defense. And I think the issues around those three areas are all going to have to increase spending by governments and put some increased inflationary pressures on the system that are going to make things a little more difficult. And while we're doing this, we're seeing a bifurcation of the global economy. This is where China, I think, plays a major role where we go over the next 12 to 18 months. Is their alignment with Russia is creating some challenges for that nation, but it's also creating challenges for the rest of the world. And how do they play this, I think, will have a big impact on how the US and Europe economies go. So I think we're going to really see the interdependencies and interconnectivities of the global economy play through in a way that's going to lead to slower growth, less pressure on the central banks. So, Mark, I'm going to stop there and open up for discussion.
Great. Stephen, you thought that you weren't going to do a good job today. You covered a lot of ground.
My favorite topic. I took some time off last week, so I'm a little behind.
As you should.
That's very good. See, this is interesting. When you had that slide up on the title for the Fed's Jackson Hole retreat, I kept reading that like 5 times. That is a very strange phrase.
Yeah,
Reassessing constraints on policy and
the economy. Yep.
What do you think that really means?
You know, you're in a bind, right? In a typical recession, you wouldn't have, you would have the slowing growth, you could cut rates, and you had the policy toolbox that you traditionally had. When you've had a zero interest rate environment and you're raising short rates up, but you have slow growth, I think they're in a box. And they also know that a lot of the fiscal stimulus that's you would usually use to generate the kind of growth you need to get out of one of these problems in a low growth environment would create inflation. So they're worried about the cure being worse than the disease itself. And I think that's really what their title is saying, is they're in a bit of a box. And the policies that they would use to solve the problem are also ones that create more problems. And I think that's really what they're up against. And
Yeah.
it really speaks to how complex the challenge is for the global economy as we move forward. And as Susan highlighted, you know, food, defense, you know, national security, food, and how you're going to power your country up is at the top of the list. And if countries are struggling with basics, then getting some of the other stuff that they want to do, the nice to haves, are going to be much harder. And I think there's a real math problem that exists here, that you can't take on a lot more debt in a lot of these countries when we're, you know, debt of 300 or more percent to GDP globally.
Yeah.
So I think it speaks to the limitations.
Sure.
and
If
challenges.
I could just follow up, I think the global PMIs last night were
Yeah.
all under expectation, which makes it further dicey.
Yep. Yeah,
Adam?
we're at a fascinating time here. Adam?
Hey, sorry.
1 second, Doug. Go ahead, Adam.
I think that's part of the challenge that's making policy really hard right now, because if the global economy bifurcates, for political, military, and economic reasons, then you have this issue where you're going to have more cost on each system, because the globalist system is pretty efficient, was pretty efficient. We saw the lack of efficiencies when you put tariffs and have pandemics and trade wars going on and real wars going on. I think it's going to gum up the works some, and I think you're having this realignment of manufacturing shifting towards more reshoring, closer to home, and more like-minded. So I think we're at one of those really funny times that it's really hard to determine exactly how it all plays out. So I think it's hard to have certainty in an environment with this much uncertainty that exists around so many areas. So I think it's a real challenge. I think theoretically we are, but I think the US and China have to determine what relationship they want to have long-term before you can say that. And I don't think they're there yet. I think we're in one of those awkward periods where China committed to support Russia. It plays to some of what they want to do, but it doesn't play to all that they want to do. So how does that play out? I think it's too uncertain. I think this is really one of the challenges and why policymakers are in a bind.
So
Just goes to show, Mark, I have no idea.
It's like me taking law school exams. So I come out of some of these law school exams like, oh, I got crushed, then I get an A. But maybe you got an A. But I know, Duncan, you wanted to say something, but I also wanted to get if people have a view of what the US-China relationship, what do we think it can or should be. But Duncan, what's your question?
Well, I was just going to say, Stephen, I'm sort of in the 50 basis point camp for some of the reasons you cited. I don't see why they have to go crush it again. But, you know, they really need the tenure to do the work over time at some point. But I was going to ask you, what did you think of that, the legislation that got passed? I looked at that, you know, for all the, you know, the polarized political environment we got, they actually did something that was sort of in the middle. And I thought it was kind of near term, a little bit contractionary. I mean, it looks to me like they've got a claim on tax revenues right away, and a lot of the stimulus they're providing in terms of you know, the green agenda, you know, it's probably good to advance that long term, but it's also complicated enough that it's back end loaded. It looked, I don't know if you, so I mean, will they look at that package and say, hey, this is actually the legislative branch doing something that's maybe slightly contractionary, and incorporate that into their calculus at all? And then the last thing I was going to ask on China, what's interesting to me is, I mean, look, China's made a lot of mistakes here, right? I mean, they're sitting there trying to save face with a bad position on Russia, a bad position on COVID, and they've got this fall, I guess they have their Communist Party's big meeting in the fall. And I'm wondering, is it kind of thing where they kind of have to hold the line to save face in front of that? But then once you get past that meeting and, you know, Xi's back and, you know, he's got his spot, could they become a little more practical? I mean, I can't believe they really want to crush growth the way they have. And being an enemy with the Western world and, you know, having this COVID policy, I mean, it's just not a sustainable position to take if they really want to grow their GDP. And then on top of that, it looks like both Putin and Xi are going to attend the G20. I mean, it's kind of like going to be a face-off.
Yeah, I think that'll be, I think the G20 will be spicy. On the China, on the mistakes or not mistakes, it's hard to say for how much of it was mistakes versus long-term planning on China's part. So I think they're playing a longer game than we are. So I think you have to keep that in mind. I think what the Fed's faced with, based on the Infrastructure Reduction Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, I don't think it's going to reduce. That was a misstatement, by the way. No, I don't think it's going to reduce inflation much in the near term. And I think it may actually, I think part of it will be inflationary. How contractionary is it going to be? I don't know. We have so much stimulus already in the system from last year that, adding a little bit more now and having it play out later on, I don't think it's going to matter that much. I don't think that's going to play into the Fed's calculus. I think the Fed's really focused on the fact that what they can control, which is really demand. You're seeing wages still going up, and that is actually a concern for them. Is they want wages to go up, but they needed the economy to be growing at a rate that allows you to absorb the wages. And I think there's a little too much wage pressure right now, so that for the Fed to get inflation under control, they're going to have to get unemployment up from 3.5% to probably 4%. And that's going to create some more slowing. So I think that's what they're going to be faced with. So I don't know that their calculus is as much on the Infrastructure Act or the Inflation Act as it will be on wages and what's going on with the employment situation in the US. Bill, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say Bill's chomping at the bit to say something.
Yeah, sorry. So I was on the phone earlier this morning with some guys who have been on the ground in China for many, many years, and kind of asked a number of these questions. And it was interesting to hear their responses in the sense that their opinion is that the whole real estate thing has been highly engineered by Beijing in order to avoid a Lehman moment. They recognized that everything was well over their skis as far as leverage was concerned. And so as he said, they decided to go ahead and rip the Band-Aid off in order to avoid a catastrophe that was going on. So it seems to me as though that Beijing has they've got a glide path in mind as far as the whole real estate sector. And it appears as though that glide path is on track. So, once again, to kind of to Duncan's point, post the party Congress later on this fall, hopefully we're going to see, some bottoming out, of that and a return to what things were more like a couple of years ago, as far as a more vibrant economics segment. But right now they're trying to take the steam off, without the whole thing, collapsing. And, the other thing that he mentioned too, is that even though China is absolutely moving towards a more consumer oriented economy as opposed to export oriented, they are still very intertwined with the West. And it's going to be very difficult to unscramble that egg. And so despite everything that they're doing and rattling and things like that, there's that economic reality, which is still going to be a major force in terms of allowing them to accomplish their longer term goals.
So Bill, I just want to we used to have a lot of China perspectives on here, but Catherine, do you mind weighing in? I know that obviously you've been focusing on China innovation in some ways, but any thoughts on where China is today and where it's going?
Yeah, I just want to point out that, we shifted our business strategy away from China like about 5 years ago. So, there's a lot of concerns, I would say, because most of our LPs are actually based elsewhere. We basically entirely moved away from China LPs. That's number one, because there was so much negativity in Silicon Valley when it comes to, doing business in China, even a few years ago. I can't comment too much because I haven't been back in China for like 3 years. But what I can say is we do see a lot of development in Singapore being kind of the Switzerland of Asia, right? A lot of the businesses have been moving there. So most of our investments are focused on elsewhere. Southeast Asia is a very exciting story. When it comes to China, what I hear from, context of mine is that there's been a lot more crackling down on the top elites. So you can see quite a bit of capital leaving China and through various means, but they used to call it 0.01%, now it's 0.0001%. So the top is getting more and more, cautious, and because of the political situation, I see a lot of families that used to be based out of Hong Kong, now based in New York. used to be based out of, China, now deciding to move to Singapore or even as far as Switzerland, right? So that's what I noticed in the market. Can't comment too much as Stephen, but I think that from my point of view, just the overall political situation is not great. And a lot of the family offices we work with are considering a more outside approach. And even if they still have business in China, it's a very separate operation from their outside businesses.
And you're going to Singapore in November, right?
Yeah, we're going to the Singapore family office, and also we have local clients there. So a lot of times our clients share with us, what's their views on the market and how they see this evolving. But yeah, I think Singapore has definitely benefited from the last 2 years of chaos.
Yeah.
I can say definitively that China continues to move aggressively into Africa and accounts for 12% of the total debt of Africa, and continues to loan to governments at a very heavy clip, especially in the commodity sectors, mining and renewables, etc. But certainly mining is very aggressively taken hold of by the Chinese generally. And we witness that on the ground all the time, from manufacturing companies that still have various Chinese icons that are maintained, to Chinese building works, building airports, building hospitals in exchange for mining stakes, etc. But it's very, very evident.
The interesting thing about that is they went in with an alternative to the US model, and that was welcomed at the time. I wonder, when you have big debts to a country that you welcomed in before, but now you owe them a lot of money and you can't afford it, do you feel the same way? So it's going to be interesting to see, does the openness of taking Chinese money evolve? We saw in the US made a lot of loans into Latin America. We were asked to leave, not so politely, lost a lot of that money along the way with US companies. So I think it's going to be one of the interesting things to see is how do they finesse that and still keep the perception that they're an ally as opposed to a carpetbagger, which I think the US has.
Quick question for Susan. This is Didi. So the 12% of the debt in Africa, how does that compare to like other powers like EU or US? Where that 12% start?
I'm not sure what the numbers are to Europe, etc. But I mean, in Africa, it's called debt trap diplomacy. And we see that, generally speaking, African governments are welcoming Chinese investment still. And it is, I mean, China must be one of the most aggressive investors, aggressive meaning active investors across the African continent. But I'm not sure what the comparisons are. I just know that 12% even 700 billion, I believe it is the number, but even that number seems low to me, because it is so evidently, China so evidently has a stamp across the countries that we work in, and frankly, most of the countries in Africa. Even more esoteric countries, even some of the more remote countries, it's not even focused on the mega cities or the urban centers. It's literally, on our drive to our Mozambican farm in the southern part of Mozambique, you pass a series of manufacturing plants that are Chinese.
So
And it's
Stephen,
not close to southern.
on
It's
the
not-
whole decoupling point, what percentage of our treasuries are owned by China today?
It's around 1.2 trillion. It's out of, I don't know, where are we, 27, 28 trillion? So would that be 4%? Something like that. It's actually come down a little bit. Their reserves have come down a little bit. I think it was as high as 1.4 at the peak, somewhere around there, 1.5. So it's down some. But as they sell off with this rate environment, we're attracting still a lot of European money because of the rate differential.
What's the total percentage it's foreign owned?
The US owns probably about 23 of the 27. The public, US public owns 23 of the 27. Japan owns 1.1 or 1.2 as well. And then the rest. I'd be able to-
Why does that worry you, Mark?
Well, it doesn't actually with those numbers. I was just asking for basis of comparison.
Okay.
I mean, in general, obviously it could be a worry of, I mean, more like dollar diplomacy. If the, you know, we've been talking about this when crypto came about, and then different times there'll be the hegemony of the dollar would be threatened.
But as Stephen was saying, right? I mean, as long as the US remains the reserve currency and the US runs a trade deficit, they can't, I mean, if they want to destroy their own economy or what's left of Chinese exports to the United States, then they can go ahead and sell the treasuries. But otherwise, there's not really anything they can do, right? I mean, it's based on trade. I mean, over time, if there's substitution and all the other things that we've been discussing, maybe that situation is going to change. But they're expecting an abrupt change in that, or using that as a form of economic warfare. You know, that's a two-edged sword.
Yeah, at that level, they're a big enough lender that it's their problem. It's not just the US's problem.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's as you pointed out very well, there's no substitute, and as Eddie Ardeni pointed out, that, you know, there's a reason why people still invest here.
Yeah, I would also just add that when you think about a substitute currency, reserve currency, it's very difficult for the world to put their faith in an autocratically run country's currency. So that makes the yen a tough candidate for it. So I think Japan is not a concern for that. I don't think the euro is a concern for that. So not really seeing somebody lining up for that. Mark, I do want to just add one thing. I last week was one of those where my mouth got ahead of my brain, particularly as I was talking about the midterms, and if the Democrats win, that would increase spending considerably. I didn't mean to say that. I did think that they had stuff on their agenda that was left undone that they would like to keep pushing. So if they were able to keep the House and the Senate, there would be a lot more programs coming. But Andrew Randak was right that they could eliminate the debt without any problem. The government would just wipe it off the balance sheet. And Joel was right that would economically help those that benefited from it. I think the issue that I was focused on is the moral hazard part of it, and the fact that the government can reduce the debt for these people by counting what they've paid so far towards their principal, and not having them have to pay the usurious rates that the government was charging. So it's going to be a complicated subject. I think we're going to hear more about it maybe as soon as this week. I think there's in the next 2 weeks, they're going to have to deal with the student debt issue in Congress or in the White House. So there'll be more coming on that. But I didn't mean to say that just because the Democrats won that they would just spend recklessly. That wasn't the intent. So I did want to clarify that since these are on record and I have to go back and watch them every once in a while. So, but Joel, you are right. It does theoretically help those most in need. I would actually make it needs-based if I was going to do waivers, and I wouldn't do it for graduate school loans. I think that's the idea that you're going to get the income out of your job. So I don't know that I would do it for that either, but I think we're going to see more on that. And I think it's going to be one of those interesting political discussions and a third rail for some as well. So did want to clarify that.
Speak. Susan hit upon that note because you're seeing it play out in Africa, for example. You're seeing it. Right.
Yep.
Yeah, and if you look at supply chain into electric vehicles and who controls what among certain metals and minerals.
They're also doing a lot of cultural things too, like building sports stadiums in the Caribbean and things like that. So if you go to Caribbean islands, you'll see a lot of new sports stadiums going up, courtesy of the Chinese government. So they're really
Baldry.
It just, what is really clear is the commodities play. It's all about commodities. It's all about securing commodities, and it's China is, as you say, playing the long game. They're more patient than any other country on the planet, and they have literally they've wrapped up the mining, the hardcore copper mining in Zambia, which is vast, has been literally sewn up by the Chinese. So mining is really where their focus is, and especially in Angola, Zambia, massively in Ethiopia, Sudan. They've concentrated in a few countries more than others, but they really have gone after commodities, timber, copper, gold.
but they still have the Achilles heel of food and energy. So
Yeah.
that's the other side of the coin for there, that they are securing some of the most important resources for innovation, and in basic needs, they are falling behind on in a lot of ways too. So it's a very interesting time for them.
But they do something really smart. They, just speaking from a personal perspective, they used to buy macadamia nuts from us in South Africa and ship them back to process them in China. And we were processors of mac nuts, but they would always insist on buying them directly and shipping them back to create jobs elsewhere. So they're very intelligent about shipping back a raw material and processing it on the ground.
Yep.
I can't comment too much about what the government's doing because I don't think anybody know that well. But I think to echo Susan's point, we do have, family offices that have been 3 generations in Zambia, in, Congo, and even South America. Lately there's been quite a bit of EV battery rush. So we're looking at deals there as well, that you somehow figure out the tribes have 3 generations of help, with local families. That really has nothing to do with government, but because they've just developed business relationship for 3 generations. Bolivia, for example. So I do see that the commodity race is quite long-term plan. But yeah, from a just local partnership point of view, I think there's a lot of also just, business level partnerships for a very long time.
And then we'll be fighting over subsea natural resources as well. It's the next battlefield.
And space.
Yep.
I've seen the Chinese offer multi-billion-dollar loans to certain Latin countries, and the US stepped in to rebuke it. Maybe not in some of the countries that there was a vacuum. The Chinese were smart. Go ahead.
catch is it's a spying operation everywhere they put that stuff.
It's interesting because I think that there is a fairly sanguine view taken of what's gone on over the last 2 decades with China and Africa. And in fact, it shouldn't be regarded as in that way at all, despite the fact that Lagarde and the IMF consistently has said that there is not funding to support Africa's infrastructure. And so the Chinese offer a good alternative. But that alternative comes with some real weight. And by the time we all look up, China will have literally occupied many countries, many centers, and taken over the commodities of Africa. So we sleep at our peril, but this has happened with our eyes wide open. And governments have basically allowed the long game to be played by Africa for years. Across the continent, you see it, and it's literally, I think, the final frontier when it comes to this. These commodity plays are so big in Africa still. Glencore is making an absolute fortune. Mining companies are really making a lot of money in Africa, and the Chinese companies and governments come in and settle and create these footholds and toeholds in all these infrastructure plays that you've mentioned in Central America, because it lets them settle and create centers and bases. And that's, on the one hand, the Africans get private pools of capital, which they require to develop, which is good. But on the other hand, the debt structures are onerous and the debt can be called. And in the case of ZESCO, it was recently, ZESCO is the electricity company in Zambia. So you see these governments then having to face the piper when they can't pay their debt.
Michael Hammer,
But they just want
one second,
one other
Roger.
quick.
Roger.
Oh, so I was just going to jump in and point out the difference between Western investments in Africa and China. So the West, for example, the US, puts money into health initiatives, things like that, what I might call soft sorts of investments. China is very cagey. They invest in stadiums, they invest in infrastructure, but they tend to do it when the leadership of the country is approaching an election, whether it's a fair election or not, because it shows people, hey, the leadership can say, look at what we've done. We've built you this nice stadium, or we've built this railroad or this highway. So there are significant differences in how the West, particularly the US, approaches investments on a national basis versus China. The other thing, switching gears slightly, and going back to what Stephen was talking about earlier in terms of inflation and price pressures, natural gas and oil have diverged. Oil dropped under 90, it's come back up a little bit. Natural gas continues to rise. It was over 10 this morning. That's a high for the year. And I'll point out that the high ever was 15. And I think we may see that. And while it, hurts people who are heating and whatnot, and particularly taking an investor perspective, the oil patch is doing quite well, thank you. Royalty checks are up, income is up for oil and gas companies. So I think when we look at, for example, the US economy, it's not really a single economy. There's variations across the board.
Well, lots of questions. I want to follow up on that, but Roger Arjun, you were starting to say
Mark,
something.
I was just going to add to it. I'm, as you know, from the Caribbean, so notwithstanding any of the comments made about China, I agree with all of them, but there's a feeling, especially there, that there's also, it's economic. We talk about commodities, resources, control of resources, all that's true, but there's also geopolitical play for China. the Caribbean, as you know, is a lot of really small islands. Many of them are total population size of under 100,000. It's very easy for China to come in there and with the plays that have already been mentioned and others, essentially bow out the governments. So they have a more sympathetic view in the General Assembly and the UN. So that's always because they could effectively buy numbers of votes in the General Assembly. So that's a prevailing view down there.